More than half of Americans think the U.S. has already entered a recession, according to a new survey from the IBD Economic Optimism Index.
Biden's Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen made the rounds on Sunday shows to discuss the impending financial doom and gloom, as 44% of economists also predict a recession in the near future. Here's what she had to say.
I don't think a recession is at all inevitable. Chair Powell, clearly inflation is unacceptably high. It's President Biden's top priority to bring it down. And Chair Powell has said that his goal is to bring inflation down while maintaining a strong labor market. That's going to take skill and luck, but I believe it's possible. I don't think a recession is inevitable.
Yellen had initially dismissed inflation altogether, so we'll have to take what she says with a grain of salt.
Last week, rumors of a gas tax were floated on Friday, and now it's looking like Biden might be weighing the measure more seriously, with Treasury Secretary Yellen discussing the tax on ABC, saying that it's an idea certainly worth considering.
Friend of the show, Rafael Bernal, joins us now. He's a staff writer at The Hill. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So let's talk a little bit about the politics of this. Obviously, Biden's poll numbers have been falling for the entirety of his presidency. People are really, I think, starting to see that this is a dire predicament with the price of everything skyrocketing, gas out of control, concerns about a recession coming. How are voters going to be handling? What do you think they're looking to the federal government to actually do? Are they looking for different policies? Are they looking for acknowledgement of their sufferings? I think sometimes the White House comes across as perhaps not taking this or not seeming to take this seriously enough, or trying to downplay the reality of it for frustrated voters.
That is a key question, actually. I always say inflation is a little bit like kryptonite for politicians, for incumbents. There's just no way to defend against it. And there's very little a White House can do sort of in the short term. There are accusations that the president's policies, including like the infrastructure and the rescue plan, have contributed to inflation, but there's debate among economists. There's really very little that the White House can technically do. And this White House has been reluctant to use sort of the more maybe gimmicky tools at its disposal. The gas tax, it's not considering seriously because it needs to do whatever it can to take away this perception of inflation and recession. But it hasn't, for instance, lowered tariffs with Europe. Some economists had said that would knock 1 point off inflation. That there was a lot of debate on there. Janet Yellen doesn't know the answer to that. Neither do I, to be sure. But they've avoided these sort of gimmicky, like high-profile political moves. Instead, sort of taking an orthodox approach that economically might work, but politically it doesn't seem to be convincing anyone.
You said there's been a lot of debate amongst economists about how we got inflation or how we should respond to it. What are your thoughts on how we landed here with such high inflation numbers?
Well, I am certainly not an economist, but there seems to be, everything goes back to the pandemic that sort of disturbed the way we've been managing the economy since the last big inflationary process in the early 80s. So conditions on the ground have changed. What I'm very interested in is this recession or potential recession just a matter of perception? Like, is it actually happening? Are people going to end up spending less money at any point? And it's the question remains, and I think the most honest answer is who knows.
Well, I think when it comes to matters of perception, obviously that influences a lot about how people, receive different things happening in politics. But I think when it comes to the recession and inflation, perception is how people are feeling it in their pockets, right? Gas is up, people are seeing prices up and going up. I don't think it's so much perception in terms of narrative. I think that there's something real there, no?
Well, inflation is absolutely there. I mean, the gas pump is a very obvious place. Supermarkets are a very obvious place to measure it. A recession, I think, is a little bit harder to measure until, it's one of those things that's measured sort of after the fact when the GDP numbers come out. And And I mean, the question is, when you poll a lot of people, do you think we're in a recession? Are we thinking that a majority of the people polled actually know the technical definition of a recession, for instance? So it becomes a lot of about feeling, and the issue about economic upswings and downturns is that people's sentiment can become self-fulfilling. And I've read there's more than a few economists that are worried
Right.
that it will become self-fulfilling.
Well, right, and there's certainly right. We can debate, how much of Biden's policy agenda is the cause of this. I think one policy that is more kind of chosen than some of the others is like COVID, very inevitable, et cetera. But the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, obviously we didn't choose that. That's not our fault. But, a strategy of continuing to equip the Ukrainians with weapons, or not being clear that they have to come to a resolution with Putin, or try harder to have some kind of diplomatic solution, even if that involves giving up territory, that kind of thing. What is going on with Russia is certainly, I think, a significant contributing factor to our gas prices, and that is something because Biden and maybe to an even greater extent others in the White House or Democratic spokespeople have been so committed, even to sometimes openly using the language of no, this is an effort to delegitimize and de-empower the Russian president Vladimir Putin, which. Fine, if that's the goal, just say it is the goal. But then that is a policy to have higher gas prices for a very long time, no?
Yeah.
Well, I believe the president did say this is going to be expensive, supporting the Ukrainians, and I think the risk-reward balance there has been pretty transparent, and it's been, can the United States afford long-term, can the West afford long-term to let Russia win anything in this war, like come out with a reward, whether it's all of Ukraine, whether it's the Donbass, whether it's legitimacy, very undeserved legitimacy for Putin, whether any of those things is worth a short-term cut in inflation. And you're right, what you said, like that's a factor I didn't mention. Putin's timing for that war was clearly designed to put the most amount of hurt on the West. And that's another thing. Can we reward Putin for starting his war at a moment that hurt us? He didn't just start a war against Ukraine. He started a war that he thought that we wouldn't, from the United States, be able to support the Ukrainians because our gas prices were going to go up so high. That was definitely in his planning and in his thinking.
I think, but there's a conversation to be had versus punishing Putin or rewarding Putin versus punishing Americans, right? I don't know if I would agree that it was the risk-reward benefit analysis was as transparent. I think initially when you saw Russia invaded Ukraine, I think there was a lot of support, especially from liberals and Democrats for helping and supporting Ukraine. But I'm not sure the average American understood that it would cost them in this way. I think people knew it would be expensive in terms of the federal government sending out aid, but I'm not sure if everybody who initially signed on recognized that gas prices would spike, or if they feel it as a little loss or a temporary thing. And I think you've seen, as this has continued, people lose a lot of faith that this is a temporary hike, and they think people don't just think we're going into a recession, people think we're already in a recession. So what do you think?
All right, this war is in there for the long term. This is probably going to be a long war of attrition unless something changes on the ground, which could. European allies are most likely going to continue to support Ukraine, whether we do or not. So that inflation is sort of baked in unless something changes on the ground. And it's true. Americans just, the one presidential speech where the president said this is going to be expensive, we're going to have to pay for this, doesn't mean that everybody listened to that speech. It doesn't mean that everybody got the same message from that speech. And certainly nobody thought it was going to be such a long-term sort of slog. And it's expensive for politicians, and it's terrible for incumbents.
Right, and maybe people did hear him say that, and just don't like that answer, don't want that.
Yeah,
that's fair.
But Rafael, thank you so much for joining us. We so appreciate it.
A pleasure being on.
And we'll have more Rising right after this. Stay with us.